Greetings, everybody. I want to welcome you to this week's Matrexit discussion call. This beautiful Sunday, the first day of the week, not the 7th, and therefore not the Sabbath also. I haven't heard anything from Jeremy today, our host. So I'm just going to cover some info I've been wanting to go over for a while now. And this should be fairly brief, although it is a pretty deep topic. And I'm going to be discussing modern money mechanics. This book was out of print for an excess of 20 years. It was published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Basically, explained to everybody, how the United States form of money actually works. And a lot of people like to say, "Oh, there's no such thing as money," and they'd be taking that really from the Constitution, which says that only gold and silver will be coined for money. So I can understand that sentiment there. But, universally, if you just look at the definition of money or what is money, all it is in any definition pretty much that you look at is an accepted medium of exchange, which means that even barter can be money, or trading things, trading something for a service. Even items that are traded can be considered money in a situation like that. But the more you kind of explore how the money system really works, you quickly learn that the United States really only has jurisdiction over their money. And since they got rid of gold and silver, which everybody cries about, to me is actually a good thing, because that means that anything that's done in a transaction with gold and silver, they likely might not have any jurisdiction over it. So that's a very positive thing. I don't know, the state of Florida, for instance, it's illegal to even have an unregistered vehicle in your driveway. And so when you go to change over a title and you purchase a vehicle, you're purchasing it from just a single seller, not a business, and you go to have that title transferred over at the DMV. Now, they get the title information, and they immediately go into the registration and the plates, whose name is this going to be in, that kind of thing. And I did this the first time, and I want to say I prefer whenever I see an action taken, whether it's by me or other people, I try and kind of follow the MOR, the more scientific method, which is M, is it measurable? O, is it observable? And R, is it repeatable? So the first time I went and did this with a car, I went and had the title transferred, and during that process, they want to know how much the vehicle was purchased for, and I told them it was purchased for a certain amount of silver. The girl kind of took a deep breath and sat back, and she said, "I'll mark this down as a gift, because they can't write down gold or silver. They don't have jurisdiction there." And after she did that, she printed off the title and gave it to me. Never one mention about registration or plates. And I said that was a one-time, so I wasn't sure if it was just a one-off situation. But several years later, I had an opportunity to purchase another car. And I did the same exact thing again and received the same exact results. Like I said, whereas any other time, they immediately walk you right into registration and plates. So I saw that as just being a big, red flag right there, that obviously there is no jurisdiction. And the value of whatever you have, but when it's measured in something that the U.S. doesn't have jurisdiction over, and guess what? The U.S. laws regarding that is not necessarily going to be applicable also. Anyway, I just kind of found that was interesting. When I really first started studying and researching what was going on in this world, what the nexus was between, for instance, us and the state, and how the governments were organized, and just going back and forgetting everything that you learned in school about history and about the state or about government or the federal government, and go in with fresh eyes, which is what you have to do whenever you're researching or studying something. You have to get rid of all your old presuppositions and look at things, look at matters with fresh eyes, and not immediately try and draw comparisons with things that you already thought you knew in the past. So like I said before, a quote by Mark Twain was that it's not what you think you know for sure that gets you into trouble. It's what you think you know that just isn't so, which is a very important thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. And that way you can keep, your presuppositions or things you learned in the past, leave them in the past and start anew, start afresh when you're researching things. And when I started looking, for instance, because it was a big topic amongst like the patriot community, is the bankruptcy. And so when I started studying that from like the 1930s and what was occurring there with Roosevelt, I think it was probably maybe like the AI links or the algorithm. It would suggest other articles. And I quickly noticed that, guess what? Canada was going through the same situation. Australia was going through the same situation. I was like, wow, hold on. There's a bigger picture at play here. And what I've quickly learned, and as I titled this video, The One World Money System, what I quickly learned is, guess what? Everybody is pretty much under the same system. When we're taught, like in churchianity or Christian or whatever, you're taught, you got to watch out for the one world government, watch out for the one world money system. Those will be signs of the times. Everything is a sign of the times, it seems like. So it's always, the position is always, oh, you got to watch out for this. It's like, wait a minute, what do you mean watch out for it? I mean, they've got us watching out for a lot of things. The Q movement, it has people, oh, just sit back, enjoy your popcorn, enjoy the show, you know what I mean? Well, in the meantime, while you're supposedly watching out for it, the markers that you're told to look for, you don't see. And that's because these things get ushered in and get brought into the system kind of through a back door or through an avenue that you haven't really been taught to pay attention to. Because a lot of times if people think about, for instance, the one world money system, I guess what everybody would assume is that, everybody's going to be using the same script. Either we'll all be using the Canadian banknote or the United States banknote or the yen or the pound. That would be the one world money system. That's not really where the power or the jurisdiction over the money comes from. It's not from the style of script that's being used. Where it comes from is from who is supplying that script. That's where the real jurisdiction is at. And if you go in and you start exploring, and I'm going to put a link for an article I wrote on this, a short little article. I'll throw that down in the description box. But so you go and look at what is important. What's important is who is supplying that script. And if you go and look, for instance, the U.S. Treasury began in 1913. Guess what? Bank of China began in 1913 also. And you look at these different governments that look at England, Australia, like I mentioned, China, United States. One of the things that stood out to me, like when I saw articles regarding Canada pop up, is it referred to their Federal Reserve System. Oh, that's kind of interesting. So let's look and see who is actually supplying this script, because that's what's important. The style of the script isn't what matters. What matters is who is supplying it. And guess what? It's the IMF. It's the International Monetary Fund. They are the ones supplying the script to all of these countries, which tells you what? The one world money system is already here. And so I recommend people go and read that book I mentioned, Modern Money Mechanics, that shows really how money works. There's, people even older than me that I've talked to just out of curiosity and ask them, what is the United States dollar backed by? And the majority of the time, they'll say gold, or they might even say gold and silver. And I think that book being out of print for over 20 years, for at least the length of one generation, really took away some of the value of knowledge regarding how money operates. And so I went through it and just wrote down some things that they stated in that book that I think really doesn't come to people's mind. And you may need to go back, listen to this again, sit down, write down some words, look them up in a dictionary, because a lot of words aren't necessarily words that we're 100% familiar with. We may think we are, but when they're being used in this context, they may mean something different, which doesn't mean necessarily that definitions were changed or anything. What you find really in the legal realm is that the words that are being used, or the terms, as they call them, that are being used, really hold their original definitions. Society slowly morphs away and steps away from those traditional definitions and kind of create our own. Like we know, for instance, the word gay doesn't mean happy anymore. There's so many words like that. The word consideration, in fact, doesn't necessarily mean what people think it does when it comes to financial situations. So I just wrote down some interesting takeaways from Modern Money Mechanics. And number one, it starts out and it talks about the three types of transaction money. And those three types were: one, currency and coin that's held by the public. Number two was demand deposits. And demand deposits are actually non-interest bearing bank accounts. And I think people would remember I've really mentioned and urged people to have a non-interest bearing bank account. There's a lot of positives that come. Number three was checkable deposits. So those were the three kinds of money of transaction that they had listed. And they stated also that intrinsically, as far as what the dollar is worth, they plain out state it's just a piece of paper or digits on a computer. That's all it is. That's how they even consider it. They don't even consider it a value. It's just a piece of paper or digits. And the value of it, they state, is merely the confidence of the people. And I think if you look on a bill, you may see like full faith and credit, for instance. Well, it's our basically unfounded faith and lack of credit. That comes right down to it. And it states in there as well, I found it was really interesting that it gave the background history as to where this fractional lending system came from. And explain how this was really started by the goldsmiths. Again, these goldsmiths quickly learned because people would come deposit their gold with them and they would get a receipt in return for it. And the majority of people wouldn't come back for their gold. So they found that they could write more receipts than what they had gold to refund money. And that worked just as well because the people were going and exchanging these receipts back and forth as far as payment, rather than actually going and getting the gold and trading the gold back and forth. They're just trading the receipts. So those old receipts were actually where the script, where the Federal Reserve note or USD, United States dollar, originated from. It's from those receipts. And they even state in there as far as creating money, how is money created? And when you read it, you kind of have to realize that they put everything in code. So you gotta kind of think about what's really going on behind the scenes as far as what they're saying. And when they said, in regards to how money is created, they said that banks can build deposits with loan and investment, right? That's their basis. And that investments were treasury bonds and promissory notes, for example. And they really even look at those promissory notes as an investment as well, because they consider those loans, they don't consider those a liability. They actually consider those loans as an asset of the bank, which kind of makes sense when you stop and think about it. But when they talk about the Federal Reserve notes, as far as like assets and liabilities go, but when modern money mechanics refers to the Federal Reserve notes, they refer to them as a liability of the Federal Treasury. And that's because those Federal Reserve notes are pretty much, they're not in the bank, they're floating around out in the public, they're in people's pockets or in their purse, and they look at them as a liability. Why is that a liability? We have to realize that every dollar that we hold in our pocket only exists for one reason, and one reason only. And modern money mechanics even says this. They say they do not lend out the deposits of people. That's not what they lend out. Because they said, and I quote, if they lent out the deposits, no new money would come into circulation. So how does that work when these loans are given out? What happens is this promissory note is made. They take that to the Treasury. The Treasury ends up packaging that up and selling it on the market, making money off of it. But in return, then they go and wire that money to the Federal Reserve Bank that this transaction is going through. And boom, that's how money appears. Money doesn't appear, because you got a paycheck. It originates from someplace. So that's where it originates from. It originates from investments and from loans. So like I said, every dollar in your pocket is a dollar that somebody else owes the bank. Totally run on a debt-based system and not of a money of value or of substance. As you go further into it, it gets a little more detailed as to what is what. And, we know it's called the Federal Reserve. So what are reserves? What do they refer to as reserves? And they refer to reserves as only being based on money that is in reserve deposits. And not even all of that is even counted. Only a fraction of that is counted as far as being a reserve or going into the plus column, I guess you could look at it that way. And they're only required, really, and I think a lot of this has been loosened, to have 10% of the money in reserves that has been lent out. And anything, I found this interesting, anything in excess of that 10% would not be interest bearing to the Federal Reserve Bank. So even that, anything in excess of 10%, I think would almost look at that as a liability as well. And I think if we go back and think about, for instance, in the 80s or in 90s when the economy was really booming, houses were being sold. And this was under the Clinton administration. And for Bill Clinton, people owning home and home ownerships, that was akin to Roosevelt's chicken in every pot, right? And that's what he was promising in the New Deal. Well, this is kind of Clinton's New Deal, but it was a way to spur on the economy. It was really encouraging entities like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to lend out money. even to lend it out without any good foundation as to what kind of income or assets that the people had who were borrowing money. They call it declared income. So, which means you could work at Jiffy Lube and go down to the bank, apply for a loan, and tell them you made $150,000 a year. And they weren't supposed to bat an eye. That was supposed to be rock solid. Put that on a piece of paper. It makes this amount of money. This is the declared income, and that was supposed to be accepted. So a lot of people ended up buying homes that they couldn't afford. I know people would get approved for, say, $150,000 loan and or $200,000 loan, and what did they do? They went out and looked out for $150,000 or a $200,000 house, without stopping and thinking that your payment on that is going to be about $1,500 or at least $2,000 a month. Can you afford that? And then, of course, when the values of those properties started dropping and they found they were upside down on their loan, a lot of people just gave up on paying and went into default on those loans. But that's really what spurred on the economy at that time, is that all this new money was being pumped into the system because of all these loans that were being given out. And this kind of reminds me of what's going on also in the last 3 years. People have been around here long enough and we're talking about this back in October of 2019. I was talking about the repo loans, which means a repurchase loan. Because at the end of the day, and you find this as well in modern mechanics, is that the banks have to balance out. Right? At the end of the working day, they've got to balance out. There's two sides of the ledger. There's your assets and there's your liabilities, and they had to be able to balance. And of course, they can't always balance. And so what banks would do and what they've done over time is they were loaning each other money for, if any interest at all, maybe 1%, 2%, and these were just overnight loans. Well, come the fall of 2019, and it started in, I believe, August, the bank started saying that they really didn't have that much confidence in the other banks that they were maybe lending the money to. So these banks went to the Treasury and said, listen, we're not helping each other balance out. There's been a lack of confidence. So we're going to need you, the Treasury, to take care of these loans for us. And this was supposed to end in October. That's why I was talking about it in October. So I was just going to sit back watching it. And like I said, it started in August of 2019. It was supposed to end in October of 2019. But guess what? It never ended. When money is being handed out, people will never stop accepting it. And so since then, trillions have been lent out. And at the end of 2019, I was looking at the amount of money that the Treasury had loaned out to all of these banks. And I stopped and thought back to that housing situation that I was just talking about. And I was thinking of that housing crash that happened. What was it, 2008, 2009? Right after that bubble burst, that housing bubble burst, what happened? The Federal Reserve had to go in. They had what was called the TARP bailout. In the TARP bailout, there was millions given to these banks to bail them out, which they never really needed in the first place. Like I said, they weren't lending their own money when they lend out money for those houses. They take the promissory note to the Treasury, and the Treasury gives them the money for it. So that they don't even have any skin in the game to start with. But anyway, right after that TARP bailout happened, that was when the housing bubble burst. And so when I saw the amount of money that the Treasury was giving out this time with these repo loans back in the end of 2019, I was saying, hey, 2020 doesn't look too good. So what happened back in the 30s when they had a problem then, when they had like a run on the banks and they got off the gold reserve system? What they did at that time was what was called a banker's holiday, because at that time, all transactions really were taking place at the bank. They didn't have ATM machines. People weren't using debit cards. They weren't even hardly writing checks. It wasn't much like the system that we've been used to the past few years. Now, all of this is all new. So during the banker's holiday, they shut the doors to the banks. They closed down the banks until they could figure out a way to stabilize things. And then what happened in 2020? What do we see happen? Well, just closing the banks, yeah, that did happen, but that wasn't enough. They also had to shut down the amount of commerce that was going on, which meant that they had to stop the regular use, for instance, of the debit machines or the ATMs. And so a lot of businesses start closing. I remember walking into one of the big chain grocery stores, and it was like 9:15, 9:20 at night, something like that. And one of the managers was walking through the parking lot as I was walking in, and they said, "Oh, we're closed." I said, "You're closed?" I said, "I thought you're open till 10." They said, "No, actually, we're normally open till 11. But we're staying those 2 hours. We're going to be closing at 9 instead. So that during those 2 hours, we're going to be using that time for cleaning due to the whole pandemic situation." I knew at that time, I was like, wow, we're in for a bumpy ride. There's going to be some shite going down here. And sure enough, it happened. So what we really saw was their version of a banker's holiday. They limited times that businesses were open. Some businesses were closed altogether, especially restaurants, very popular business. That takes up a huge part of the economy. Shut them down. And today there's still a lot of businesses that are suffering due to that, due to the things that were put in place. And people still have this mindset, this fear in their head. And fear is the best thing to use to control people. You know, probably the best days I'll have to look back is to when the best days were in America. And most people would go to maybe their younger years and say that those were the best years. I would say probably the best year early in America was in 1835, when the U.S. debt, not just the local debt, but also international debt, was totally paid off by Andrew Jackson. Unfortunately, we'll never see that again. But what we can do, and what I do recommend people doing, is going out and purchasing this book, Modern Money Mechanics. You can get a PDF of it online. I went online, got a PDF of it, and made a hard copy for myself. Also purchased a hard copy online, had it in both formats, and read through it. Kind of wrap your head around how this system really works, because it really is a global monetary system, and it's really a global one world government as well. I think this should have been recognized during the last 3 years also. Did this pandemic just affect America? No. This was a worldwide event. It hit every nation. That right there should tell you that there is one superior, well, I don't like using the word superior, but one governing authority that's in control of everything today. And, so go out, purchase that book. It can be a tough read, especially because it's using a lot of terminology that people aren't used to. So at the same time, you might have to pull out a dictionary. You can kind of follow along with it and start connecting the dots, and things really start making sense when you do that. And just realize, I know we're doing this as episode 8 for Introduction to Legal Research, but to me, the money is a huge part of legal research, because so much of the jurisdiction follows the money. People need to realize that. And right now, there is a governing authority that has a global jurisdiction. Good night, guys.